Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of Boethius. Specifically, we're going to talk in detail about his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy. This is one of those works that a lot of people really love and a lot of people really hate. Just some background on myself, right? This is the copy that I bought when I did my master's program. And when I read it years ago, I absolutely hated it. I despised it. I felt that it was miserable to read, right? This was back in 2017. And I was younger now than I am. I was younger then than I am now. And at the time I didn't appreciate it. I didn't like it. In preparation for this course that I'm teaching, I had to go back and reread it. And I like it a lot more now that I'm older. Perhaps this is one of those books that you appreciate when you're older instead of when you're younger. So if you're a younger person and you read through it and you find that you don't like it, maybe try reading through it a little bit later in life and you might really like it. And, as it comes to that, let me also say that you'll find often throughout life that a lot of books that you don't like as you're younger, you'll like when you're older, and some books you like when you were younger, you won't like when you're older, right? So I guess that's just a part of life. We change every day. Each one of us changes in imperceptibly small ways, and we don't realize those changes until at some point in the future we're a completely different person than what we were before. And it's kind of interesting how that happens. But with that being said, let's continue on. These are the topics we'll be talking about. We'll talk about the life of Boethius, and then we'll talk about all these other things related to, well, we'll talk about all the chapters of the Consolation of Philosophy, right? Boethius, he has a kind of interesting life. In some ways, his life is pretty similar to like Aristotle. And in some ways, it's also kind of similar to like Machiavelli, right? Like he is, he starts out, he's orphaned at a young age, and he's raised by Quintus Symmachus, who was an aristocrat, and becomes future consul. Um, it's believed that Boethius's dad was a praetorian, and he was would have been in a pretty good position in life if his father hadn't died. Throughout his early life, he became highly educated, and he was, with his own time, at least based off of the writings we have that talk about his life, he was very well respected for his studious nature and how educated he was, right? It was one of those things that among his peers, they really recognized his genius, so to speak. However, that doesn't always make you popular, right? And in addition to that, he was also very strict with his moral code, which both in ancient Rome as well as in the modern world is not actually a benefit in politics, right? But let's continue on. So he works under King Theodoric the Great, who was an Italian king, and he really rises up through the ranks. He's a senator, he becomes a consul, a magister, right? But he was very unpopular among the politicians because he tried to be as much as possible morally upstanding and morally right. And in politics, that will come back to bite you in the butt, especially in this time. If you make enemies of the wrong people, they'll have you executed, which is what ends up happening to him. He ends up getting imprisoned and executed by Theodoric. And, while he's in jail, he writes The Consolation of Philosophy, which is his most famous work. Now, he did write other things. He wrote on mathematics, religion, a whole variety of topics, but this is the one that really lasted. And if you read it, you'll see why. Let's go to the next slide. So, one thing that really sets this apart from, a lot of philosophy books, if you read it, you'll notice there are these parts where it breaks out into poetry, right? Or he's got long quotations from the Iliad or from the Aeneid, right? Um, and that is something that really, really separates this. And it was one of the more influential books of the early medieval period. And it's something that you'll find later medieval thinkers referencing and talking about. And it became so influential that we're still talking about it today, whereas a lot of his other works have more or less been forgotten to time. He talks about a lot of stuff in here, a lot of persistent human topics, and it contains allusions to scripture, but not a lot of strong biblical quotes, right? Like if you watched my Augustine lecture or my earlier Aquinas lecture for a different class, you know that there were a lot of Bible talk going on there. There's very little Bible talk going on in here. Some people claim that he lost his faith, but honestly, if I was a guessing man, I would say that, he's sitting in jail writing this. He probably didn't want to stir up any controversy, right? Because at this point in history, a lot of religious debates related to theology haven't been settled, and there's a lot of bad blood related to different theological positions. And he was probably hoping he'd be released, and he didn't want, someone to find a copy of this and be like, oh, well, not only is he, you know, uh, a treasonous guy, but also apparently he is he believes religious opinions that we don't like, right? So that's probably the main reason it got left out. Now, what makes this work really unique is it expands on the ideas of Aristotle with sort of a Neoplatonist twist, right? So that is, if you remember from your ancient Western philosophy class, right, you got Plato, and then you have a bit of a break off with Aristotle, right? There's kind of a split between the two of them because Aristotle has a slightly different metaphysical view. You have the Neoplatonists who come around and they start pulling a lot of stuff from Plato, and they find it really aligns well with Christian doctrine. And then we get to Boethius, who says, well, hey, I like the stuff Aristotle's doing. I like this Neoplatonist stuff. And I think it fits really well with the scriptural picture that I'm trying to paint. So let's jam these bad boys together and see how it works. Book one is where our story starts. Boethius is in jail. He's telling the muses, these are goddesses of art and music, about his woes. Right? He's really just laying it on heavy. Woe is me. My life is ruined, etc., etc. Philosophy appears in a flash, and she chases away the muses. Philosophy calls them hysterical skanks, and says that she has the cure for Boethius. Sitting around and trying to do art and poetry isn't going to help you if you're suffering. Philosophy is going to be the thing that helps you. Now, one kind of bit of symbolism we have with Lady Philosophy is that she wears kind of a dusty dress, showing that philosophy's been kind of forgotten about. But it's also had pieces of the dress kind of ripped off, symbolizing these different people throughout time who have grabbed at philosophy, they've grabbed at wisdom, and they've got a little chunk. Plato got a chunk, Aristotle got a chunk, right? So that's kind of what we're seeing. Now, kind of funnily, Boethius does actually blame Plato for his misfortunes because Plato says that philosophers need to go into politics, and it's only once we have a philosopher king that problems will really get solved. That's not really related to any of the greater arguments of the book, but I did find it funny, so I want to talk about it here, right? But philosophy reminds him, after, basically shutting him down on his Plato talk, philosophy reminds him that no matter how bad things are, he still has his own soul, right? And that's a good thing because as a man, as a human, Boethius is a spiritual being. He's not just blood and flesh and sinews. He's got this whole spiritual side to him. And he can be in communion with God, this eternal good. And that's something we'll talk a bit more as this goes on. So Boethius complains about how he misses his wealth and his fame, but philosophy reminds him that those things were never really his to begin with. They were on loan from fortune, and if you have read your Machiavelli, you know he probably read Boethius and he has strong feelings about fortune. I don't want to get age restricted, so I won't say the things that Machiavelli says about fortune, but needless to say, they're unpleasant. So philosophy reminds Boethius that all these good things were on loan from fortune, and fortune is fickle, and fortune will take them away. They're never really ours. But there is a good thing that comes from when we have these bad situations, and that it's that it shows us who our real friends are, which I know sounds super corny, right? That's, that's one of those Hallmark TV kind of life lessons. Well, yeah, you see who your friends are, but it was true back 1600 years ago. It's true now, right? You'll have bad things happen in your life, and there will be people who you thought were your friends who will just not want to deal with you, right? And we see that a lot, especially in modern times. People are trying to do self care, and to some extent, that leads them to becoming tar pits, basically. They don't owe anybody nothing. They ain't going to inconvenience themselves for anybody. So, you have something bad happen to you, and then they just abandon you because, well, they don't want to hurt their self care, right? So that's something that still occurs today, and it in some ways it is true. When you have something bad, you will see who your real friends are. Next, philosophy and Boethius debate about if humans can achieve happiness with goods or honors, and no, the answer is no. They're both temporary. People can only possess their intellect and their soul, and happiness, which is going to come from the intellect and the soul, can't be achieved with temporary goods, right? Anything that's temporary isn't going to please your immortal soul. But there's only one other thing that is high enough on the food chain, so to speak, that it can please you, and that's contemplation of the immortal, all good God, right? And this is something that will get talked about later, but we kind of get the seeds sown early on here. Now, if it seems like this is going really, really fast and it's covering a lot of stuff, that's because it is, right? If you read this book, try reading it from cover to cover. They talk about a lot of stuff. There are a lot of really great quotes too, but they talk about a lot. It is a roller coaster ride. So you gotta buckle up, Buttercup, if you're reading the Consolation of Philosophy, because they'll be going so fast, and you almost got to take notes sometimes to really keep up with where the conversation's going. Because again, the depth and the breadth of what they're covering is phenomenal with the just detail they go into. They go on to talk more about what people think are good things. So people think that like wealth, power, pleasure are all good, but turns out they're not. They're fleeting, right? They're temporary. We learned before, and some of them may be addictive. Now we use the word addictive in our time, but in the time of Boethius, they would be things that would be passions, and they would make you a slave to the passions. And since no temporary or material things can bring us happiness, there has to be an immaterial God who's the true source of happiness, right? So here we're starting to see this kind of connection to the Neoplatonist, but we're also seeing a little bit of a sketch for an argument for the existence of God, right? So Boethius says, well, we've got to have happiness somehow. but nothing here on earth can bring us happiness. So there has to be an infinite immaterial God who's the source of happiness, right? So this God exists outside of time, and he's the source of happiness. He wants nothing, he needs nothing, he's pure simplicity, he's a self sufficient unity, right? So again, we're getting these Platonist ideas because this description of God is a little bit different from the Christian version of God, right? This is a version of God that is just kind of floating off in space, contemplating himself for all time or something, right? The Christian version of God is a character. He wants things, he does things, he comes to earth as a man, he gets angry, he's vengeful, right? So again, this Platonist idea of God. And let me say also that this Platonist idea of God is pretty close to what most modern Christians think about when they think of God. The only kind of added exception is that Christian God is a trinity, right? That's a triad, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Um, but we don't see that with Platonist conceptions of God, right? Once they've established that there has to be a God, well, the question comes up, okay, if this God's perfectly good and he's all powerful, why is there still evil? Well, first, philosophy reminds us that all evil's going to be punished, with a clever allusion to, I believe, the book of Matthew. Then we're taught the most important lesson with this idea of evil is that if God's goodness is the only thing that can bring us true happiness, right? And they're not even talking about hell at this point. They're just talking about just contemplating and connecting with God. If it's the only thing that can bring us true happiness, then evil people are cut off from that because they're focused on material goods, they're focused on fame, they're focused on power. They're not so much focused on seeking this high, good, immaterial God. They become more beast-like as the days go on. They they even argue, Boethius and philosophy even argue that evil ceases to exist because it's powerless. Now, anyone who's ever suffered at the hands of an evil person will tell you that evil doesn't seem to be powerless, but they mean powerless in the grand scale, right? So, in C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, which kind of shows this vision of what heaven would be like, it's just a kind of a fanciful exploration of theology. Evil and hell are small, they're tiny, they exist in a single crack way down under the ground. And as the people are coming up out of hell, they actually, come to be regular size. But the evil is so small and so powerless in comparison to the power of the good, right? The evil people will eventually be punished, right? And when they are punished, they experience purifying good, right? The punishment is going to drive them from their wicked ways and make them good. They're going to be purified. So that's kind of the discussion on evil. Then it does change gears about halfway through talking about foreknowledge and free will. So God knows all the things that happen. He exists outside of time, and all events happen at once as he views them. They have this long discussion, and it occurs over the course of many, many paragraphs. But basically, what they're saying is time and humanity exist here, and God exists here. And all of time happens at once to God, right? So God sees your birth and your death at the same time. He sees your happiness and your sorrow, everything, right? Because he's not part of time. It's like he's watching every part of a movie all at once. So, say you've got a 60-minute movie. He has 60 screens and he watches each minute of the movie at the same time. Now, to a human, that sounds completely disorienting, but to a god, that's nothing, right? So they really break this up, though. So if God knows everything, well, then there can't be free will, right? Because this is the question. How can there be free will if God knows everything? Well, philosophy describes it like a man looking out the window, right? You look out the window and you see someone doing something. That doesn't cause them to do whatever they do. They're going to do whatever they do, and you're just observing them. But especially because God exists out of time, outside of time, his foreknowledge does not connect with our reality, so to speak. So providence is God's foreknowledge. It's his ability to see all of time in an instant. And fate is our understanding of it, right? So we are limited in our views. We don't know what's going to happen. Fate is how we understand that, right? Now, of course, with all this, there's causes. Everything's got a cause. Nothing happens without some sort of cause. And Boethius asks the very reasonable question, okay, well, what about luck? What about these things that seem to be unexpected? Well, philosophy explains that as trying to do one thing but getting an unexpected result. The unexpected result had causes, but you as an individual were not aware of those causes, so therefore to you it appears to be good fortune. Everything has hidden causes. We don't know what those causes are. God knows what they are. And rationality is something that requires us to have free will that's free from hidden causes. We have to, if we are to be rational, we have to be able to make decisions that are not caused by these hidden causes. Boethius and philosophy then go on to talk about how the more rational a person is, the more virtuous they will be, and the more seeking the eternal good they will be. And God knows all of our free choices, but since he exists outside of time, his knowledge doesn't influence him, right? He's like the man watching us through a window. We don't know what he knows, but he knows. So then the question comes up, okay, well, if we've got if our whole life has been determined from beginning to end, why should we even pray, right? And this is how you can tell it is you know, religious books. Those claims that Boethius suddenly became an atheist just don't seem to hold any water, especially when we get to the end of book 5, because the question of prayer comes up. You know, and Boethius rightly asks, okay, if God knows everything that's going to happen in our lives, why should we pray? And philosophy says that prayer is how we connect with God. And if we want pure happiness, we need to try and connect with God. We're temporal, God is eternal, and we want to be part of that eternity, and prayer is how we do that. That's how we communicate, come in communion with God is through prayer. And it ends with kind of a final little bit about virtue. Even though God knows all, to us here on earth, the world is a mystery, right? We don't know what's going to happen. We can't see the future. You know, I grabbed this. I don't know what's going to happen to it, right? These things are unexpected. They occur to us at random. They're not random because they have hidden causes, but we don't know what they are. Our knowledge is limited. It's like a mustard seed. God's knowledge is infinite, like an ocean. That's really the consolation of philosophy in a nutshell, right? It talks about a lot of stuff. It is sometimes hard to keep up with, and it is something that probably you will appreciate more if you're older than if you're younger. We get to the wrap up here, and we see that Boethius is really the start of a strong medieval philosophy tradition. We had Augustine before, but Boethius to me really seems to be a turning point. He was a hugely influential philosopher, and he represents a serious effort by medieval thinkers to synthesize reason with divine revelation, right? many people today like to look at the medieval philosophers, and kind of scoff at them with this kind of we're better mentality. But these thinkers, they weren't a bunch of ignorant hicks who were just blindly, quoting the Bible and ignoring science. No, they were doing the best they could at the time, right? This is before the scientific method. This is before a lot of the modern methods of scientific experimentation that we have today, modern technology. So for them to make discoveries, they had to do it through reason. They had to really think about things and sort these things out, right? They believed God wanted us to explore and learn the mysteries of the universe. They weren't a bunch of people who wanted us to sit around in ignorance. They wanted us to learn math and science because they believed that those things glorified God and that they proved God's existence even further. And that's what Boethius sets out to do. He's in jail. He's going to be executed. And in his last kind of act, he wants to show that there is a good God who we can connect with, and that we should be virtuous in order to connect with this good God. He wants to show that we have free will. He wants to show that the things that we think are important, like fame and power, are not important, that there's only one good thing, and that is God, right? So we see Boethius really trying to speak to the soul of the human condition. He's trying to speak to our souls. He's trying to connect with us on that personal level. And to me, that's an incredible thing. And that's what I think makes Boethius worth studying today. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you're able to read through the Consolation of Philosophy and really come to understand Boethius, because he's an interesting guy, but you got to be on your A game to read him. He's going to have a lot of references to the classics, to these Roman and Greek poets and all that. So you got to be ready. You got to bring your A game. You can't slack off when Boethius is in the house. And that's all I got. Thank you so much for your time. You have a wonderful day.